Hi, I'm Claire Pomeroy, President of the Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation. I'm delighted to join Ushma Neal from the Journal of Clinical Investigation to look back at the conversations that she has had with 10 of the previous winners of Lasker Awards.
The JCI's had the distinct honor of partnering with the Lasker Foundation over the last 5 years to write about each year's winners, and I've also had the pleasure of interviewing several of the year's former laureates in the JCI series, Conversations with Giants in Medicine. These interviews give a personal story to the laureates and also are an excellent way of learning more about their extraordinary science.
Ushma's interviews provide rich insights into scientific breakthroughs and inspiring glimpses of the researchers themselves. Today, we showcase some of the laureates' finest moments. We start by weaving together the stories of their origins and how they chose a career in science.
So, yeah, I was brought up in a town called Kingstree, South Carolina, that had about maybe 3,500 to 4,000 people. It was called Kingstree because during the Revolutionary War, the king had planted a tree there and the colonists cut it down.
Okay.
So that's why it's called Kingstree. But I always say that there are three famous people from Kingstree, South Carolina, Bernard Baruch, and me, and a movie star who nobody's ever heard of.
Right. Right.
There are three famous people from Kingstree. So anyway,
There is a sign, may I
know
interject,
exactly
which has
right.
your name on it
Right,
there.
it says, I went to a high school that had 60 students. In those days, there was complete segregation. It was an all-white high school. The county that I lived in was half black and half white. But I had really good teachers. I would say they focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right.
So, and I had a great chemistry teacher. I guess that was my first real interest in science was chemistry in high school.
Mm-hmm.
That might tell you about a different.
So we
Let me
from
first
Brooklyn.
let me say one thing about Kingstree. Joe's heard this before, but I used to think Kingstree was in the middle of nowhere, and then I went to visit it, and I realized the middle of nowhere is a defined place. It's the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Kingstree is off to the side.
Of nowhere.
It's really remarkable that Joe grew up there with it and became such a scholar.
All right, so I think from the moment you start speaking, your Brooklyn intonations are going to betray your beginnings. But do you think you can tell me a little bit about what life was like on the streets of Bensonhurst?
Yeah, it was a terrific childhood, I think. It was in Brooklyn. My family, my mother and father are first generation Italian Americans. My grandparents were born in Italy. They did what so many immigrants did, arrived in New York City, lived for a little bit in Little Italy in Manhattan, moved to Brooklyn, where my mother and father lived. Essentially their entire life was where I was born. It was a very nurturing atmosphere and environment, a lot of family values, a lot of community appreciation, a lot of friends, some tough knocks. Growing up in the streets of New York City is, sometimes I wouldn't say not the easiest thing in the world, but certainly challenging for a young child.
Well, I grew up mostly in Australia, but as an immigrant. I arrived in Australia when I was about 8.5 from France, but that wasn't my first home. First home was I was born on the Russian-Polish border. My father was lucky enough to be able to take his family out of there at the end of the war and went to France where he had a sister that helped to get the necessary formalities. But somehow life in France in the immediate post-war era was difficult, and so he wanted to move on. He had two cousins, both doctors, one in New Haven, one in Melbourne. They both filled out immigration papers for him, and the Australian ones came first, so off we went to Melbourne. and that's where I grew up.
Well, I grew up in a city called Catania, which is in Sicily, in southern Italy. Actually, it was a very nice city with a beautiful geographic setting. We're next, to Mount Etna, which is the highest volcano in Europe, and then the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. So the city is a pretty place. And my parents were, my father was a judge, and my mother was actually, she has a teaching credential, even though she really never taught, and I was fascinated, by law. My father took me to court, a number of times, and so did his brother. My uncle was a criminal lawyer. Even though I thought it was very interesting, it was never enough really to think, oh, I want to be a lawyer or a judge. The person, probably the great influence on me was my maternal grandfather. Was actually a science, teacher. I still remember this house full of books, probably thousands of books. I was so fascinated by those. Sometimes I believe I stole some of these books, even though then I returned all of them, And I think that was really what began me an interest in science.
I was brought up, as you mentioned, in the household of a general practitioner. My mother was a psychiatric social worker. There was an anticipation that a nice Jewish boy in the South Shore of Long Island, who was raised by professional parents, who had a very strong public spirited outlook, would end up being a physician, and indeed that was my assumption all through high school. But when I got to college at Amherst, I suddenly discovered a much wider world. Ended up being an English major, writing a thesis on Dickens, running the school paper, getting a C in organic chemistry, and deciding after a prolonged period of ambiguity to go to graduate school in English, which I did for a year. And during that year, decided I would reapply to medical school, which I had decided not to go to before. Then I went to Columbia and actually loved it. I changed my mind about specialties many times. I went there thinking that as somebody who liked words and books and was interested in the workings of the mind, I'd be a psychiatrist. Soon dissuaded from that. Became interested in internal medicine, in part because of its narrative aspects, that is the medical history and the detection part of it, figuring out what's wrong with somebody. But I'd never done any science, and that was a key element, and it was only, I believe, because I didn't have much choice as a draft eligible MD in the late 60s who was fiercely opposed to the Vietnam War, that it was Canada or the Public Health Service. And fortunately, despite any research credentials, I was matched with a laboratory, which was not by any means my first choice, but I'm very glad I ended up there.
Well, I got to medical school via the Navy. By that I mean I went from high school into the Navy for about a year and a half. And after discharge in October 1945, and armed with the veterans' rights, I've forgotten the name for it anymore. I was launched in what was a direction that had become increasingly clear, namely medical school. And I think the reason that I was interested in medicine is that my mother had been a nurse, and I thought very highly of her. And because she had a high regard for doctors, I wanted to be one, probably for that simple reason. So in 1947, I received a BA degree, and I was off to medical school at Northwestern. After the first 2 years, I had developed a great interest in neuroscience, and then I dropped out of school for almost a year and a half to do pure research in neuroscience, which resulted in a PhD. After I dropped out again a year later, before my senior year, and then finally went back and got a degree. And went to Johns Hopkins?
Well, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City with no great expectations for anything other than muddling my way through life. I think in my family the expectations were that if you were reasonably good in school you'd end up being a doctor, and that was the path I found myself on, and ended up completing medical school and doing a residency, at which point I realized I wasn't so enamored of the idea of being a doctor, and at that point found my way into science.
So I read that you had a bit of a gap year in between the finishing of your residency and the starting of your fellowship, and that was part of what set you on the path.
Yeah, so I finished medical school when I was fairly young because I was in a 6-year medical program, started a medical residency, and in those days you needed to apply for medical subspecialty training about a year in advance. And I missed the deadline, and so when my medical residency was about to end, I didn't have any actual plans, having now been accepted into a fellowship program that was a year later. So I wasn't sure what to do with that gap year. One of my professors at Albany Medical College, where I was training, thought I might like medical research, and so referred me to Mary Jean Creek at the Rockefeller University to try research for a year.
So I was born in Israel in '47. It's the year that Israel was declared as an independent state, directly into the War of Independence. And to parents that immigrated from Poland as kids, so they got to know one another. They met in Israel, and the families left Poland because of rising anti-Semitism. Their parents felt that this is not the place for them, and they immigrated to then not Israel, but British Palestine. And I grew up in a home, I would say, blue collar, very medium, low salary. My mother was a clerk, my father was a clerk, then he studied law. I have had and have an older brother, 14 years older than I am, that at the end I was very lucky to have this age difference, because when my parents died, he kind of adopted me. And I grew up in a small city on the slopes of the Carmel Mountain. The mountain and the trees and the nature were just behind home, so maybe this is part of my falling in love with nature early on. And the one thing that I truly remember at home, that we didn't lack food, but it was really a very modest home, but flooded with books. I mean, we had libraries, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, libraries, Jewish books, law books, less science, because I was kind of the only one in the family that was interested in science. My parents taught me to read and write early on, and they made sure that I will read and be curious. And so I remember all the time kind of a scholarly. My father spoke 7 fluent languages. And though he was a lawyer, he was mastering algebra and geometry. He helped me doing my homework. And it was kind of a scholarly environment, but very free. Yeah. My brother is a lawyer, my father is a lawyer, and so I grew up to become the black sheep of the family. But it was really books, reading, knowledge, curiosity.
So as you can gather from my accent, I was born and grew up in Germany. I was actually born in Göttingen, which is a small university city, just very close to Hanover. My parents were both physicians, and my father was at the university. He was interested, in fact, in how diseases develop in terms of metabolism. So he was interested in particular in lipid metabolism, which is kind of ironic given my later career. I went through the regular schooling in Germany, and while I was a teenager, my father died, and so that certainly influenced my development considerably. After school, I decided to study medicine and to become a physician myself, not because of the family tradition. There was none apart from my own parents, but because I felt that medicine was the best way to learn as much as possible about the world and to be in a later position to do something practical and useful. And so in Germany, the system is very different from the United States in that medical school starts immediately after high school. High school is longer. So when I started medicine, I had gone through a longer curriculum of high school, and I then started in medicine, which is a 6-year curriculum. And that's basically how I embarked on biomedical, on a biomedical career.
As a child, were you fascinated by science at all, or nature?
To be honest, no. You know, it's what always fascinated me and still fascinates me is knowledge, but insights, understanding.
As you have heard, Lasker laureates come from diverse backgrounds, and yet they're all drawn to the wonder of biomedical science. One question Ushma asked, however, is what would you do if you weren't a scientist? Now, most of these scientists never considered another career, and the biomedical community is glad they didn't. But let's listen to what some of them said when asked if they could do it all over again.
Well, I mean, I would, you know, again, I've had the luxury of doing something I really like to do, which I don't think most bankers feel, although they might. I mean, I like the operational aspects or the day-to-day things I do, independent of any of the sorts of other motivations someone might have. So I could imagine myself as writing about history. I really like history. I could imagine myself as a sports writer. Those two come but professional athletes probably out of the question because it requires some ability for that. So I'd probably go with history or sports writing.
At least 3 things in that list. One is journalism, which I certainly entertained for a while when I was running the Amherst College newspaper. And my wife is a journalist, and I like what she does. Second possibility would be professor of English literature. After all, I was on my way there as a graduate student and liked that a lot. I wish I were more talented either as a musician or as an athlete to have entertained careers in those areas. I love bike riding. I don't think I have the strength, talent, and competitive spirit in high enough quantity to be a professional bike rider, but I would find that entertaining. Or I'm not sure I could maintain the pace required either to be a member of a chamber quartet or or on the professional tennis cycle. But those would be things I would enjoy doing. The problem is I probably would only want to do them 10% of the time.
If I were doing it now, I often feel that the culture I grew up in Germany was a culture which put an enormous value on the intrinsic importance of knowledge and truth. And I feel that that cultural attribute has sort of become less over the last decades. And I think that nowadays I would be more interested in sort of a more, not that I would be able to do it, but in a more advocacy role, because I feel that although there's much we don't know, that we also must discuss, understand, promote, possibly, or maybe dispense with this idea that knowledge is intrinsically important and how we deal with it in a society.
By the time I was 10 or 12 years old, I was going to the hospital, the only one in Le Mars, Iowa, and watching a surgeon named Downing. He was a general practitioner who was also a quite skillful surgeon, doing major operations, radical mastectomies and other procedures. And he was quite surprised. I went to his office and asked him if I could come up and watch his operations, and he allowed me to do that, taking pains to be able to cart a fainted body out of the room, which didn't occur. And I remember very distinctly some things that he pointed out as he was carrying out operations like radical mastectomy. Here is a long thoracic nerve of Bell and other anatomic features. So I don't believe I ever considered any other pathway from the time I was a sub-teenager onward.
Maybe I would have, I'm interested in ancient history, in classics that I read, for fun. But I don't think I would been able to make a career out of that. I think I'm very fortunate in being able to find, in science, in research, what I really want to do.
Well, I grew up in Australia, so this is a sports-made culture. So I did play a lot of tennis, and I enjoyed it. Tennis was a very low-ranking sport in the social hierarchy in Australia. In Melbourne, it's Australian rules football, but I'm about 1 foot too small for being good at Australian rules. So instead, I was playing tennis at school. But that had an advantage because I'm 100% certain that none of my school friends are still playing Australian rules more than 50 years later, but I can still play tennis, and I enjoy playing tennis with my son. But I wouldn't have never become a professional tennis player. I think they also are rather more physically substantial specimens.
It would almost certainly be in the arena of teaching something. It could be teaching Latin, or it could be teaching English, or it could be teaching something. But I love to teach because I like to take complicated concepts and make them simple for someone to understand. There's a certain rush you get when someone is confused about something and you explain it in a way that they really can understand the concept that you're trying to make. So I would think teaching in whatever subject I happen to like, if I wasn't doing science or medicine.
So I don't know what I would have done if I would have been, I probably would have gone to a neuroscience. But the ubiquitin system is in the brain, and so we are working on it also in the brain. We are now working on maintenance, the ubiquitin system, and maintenance of synaptic integrity. So we are pushing our hands. I'm driven by curiosity, so whatever is interesting. As long as the name ubiquitin is pegging the top of the page, it's in the title.
I trust that after hearing these stories, you'll all be compelled to hear more. So Clara and I went back and watched all the videos and chose a few of our other favorite vignettes from among the interviews.
Many of our laureates faced scientific and life challenges and triumphed over them with perseverance, resilience, the support of colleagues and loved ones, and often a marvelous sense of humor. We can all be inspired by their stories.
In 2010, you were knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. What was that process like? Do you have a sword? Did you get a cape? Did they give you a white horse as well?
You don't get it. They don't give you anything. But in fact, it's quite funny. I mean, in my the Queen is now mid-80s, so now it's nearly always done by Prince Charles. And before the ceremony, they sort of write to you and ask some interesting questions. And one is, can you kneel? Okay. And then, can you get up? These are interesting questions, but if you look at the average age of people getting knighthoods, it's not entirely. But it was a very nice ceremony at Buckingham Palace. There were, they give probably about 24 knighthoods a year, and so it's broken up.
But I always tell our students, almost sort of half-jokingly, that 95% of the literature is wrong,
right.
And the other 5% was written by us.
Right. I like it.
Do you have a favorite Latin or Greek phrase? Can you still speak any of it? Do you remember any of it?
Well, I have. My favorite Latin one is one I have to deal with every day as director of NIAID, and that is illegitimi non carborundum, which translates, don't let the bastards wear you down.
The fact is that after arriving at UCSF and becoming part of this team and having a very long-term partnership with Mike Bishop and other folks out there, I was living in a kind of scientific nirvana. Great colleagues, unlimited potential to do science, substantial but not overwhelming teaching responsibilities, no need to work to serve on committees. And I was having a feast there. I love living in California. I do a lot of things that require mountains, seashore, good roads for bike riding. I enjoyed the culture of San Francisco. So there were a lot of reasons to be there and stay there forever. But I had what I guess you could call a midlife crisis. Mike and I had just won a Nobel Prize. I hesitate to self-advertise with that, but it did play a very significant role in my life history because up until then, I was a respected scientist, but not someone you would necessarily turn to for the verdict on some social or political issue. But that little medallion gives you a certain authority, and if you want to use it, you can use it very effectively. And I began to realize that just after we took our trip to Stockholm, and people began to ask, would you speak out on this, this, or this? Now, I didn't think I had the knowledge or the right to speak out on issues of politics in general, or whether we should be going to war with certain countries. But I did think that I knew enough about how the politics of science operated and what the effect of governmental decisions would be on training, funding of scientists, the integrity of science, the way in which we support science financially. And I began talking about those things and got quite interested in how these issues are worked out, the role of the NIH, how the scientific community interacts with the administration, with Congress. And as those activities increased, over the next 2 or 3 years in the early 90s, suddenly an opportunity loomed. I was already interested in taking on some kind of leadership position, was turned down for one job I was interested in. Always good to remember that. My brother-in-law said, how good does your CV have to be to get that job? But in early '93, just after Clinton became president, the directorship of the NIH became available. And I thought, why not at least have a look at it? And so I threw my hat in the ring and was interviewed and got along with Donna Shalala, who's the secretary of HHS, and the job was mine.
Now, in preparation for this interview, I read a fair bit of the previous interviews that you have given and some of your biographies. And in one of the interviews you'd given in the past, you told the interviewer that there was a moment when you were facing so much uncertainty about the nature of your research that it was hard to get funding. So you were finishing your clinical training with 3 small children. You had to take a trip and you had to spend the night either in a movie theater or on a park bench. And on one occasion you had to smuggle a lab rabbit out of your lab at Northwestern in order to...
Oh, those were true stories.
So how did you weather that period of uncertainty and keep persevering in what must have been just an undaunting and difficult task to accomplish?
I don't know that I gave it the kind of deep thought that that you're implying I should have had, but somehow I thought that everything was going to turn out all right. But I think that the greatest source of anxiety was not so practical as all that. I didn't know for sure what to do, and so I described in one of these little things that were prepared for the Lasker Prize that I referred to myself at one time as a missile searching for a trajectory. I was bursting with energy. I really wanted to do something that wasn't conventional, wasn't going to be bread and butter surgery as a means of making money, but I wanted to do something important. that would have a life of its own, that would endure. But what to do? I had come to be regarded as a dilettante, having gone through a PhD in neuroscience and then a PhD equivalent in working out the heart block problem, and here I was wandering around, not pursuing either field. I just didn't know what to do with myself, and I was also getting pressure from my father, who was getting sick of sending me money, and I was getting pressure from my first wife's family, who had means, but they didn't like the idea of providing a dole, and I was even more uncomfortable in accepting that kind of help. So the problem was really what field I should be working in. And at that time, at the height of those concerns, when I went to Philadelphia, it was to be certified or to go through the examining process that would make me a qualified thoracic surgeon. And now I had, and I had all those skills in cardiovascular surgery and in just about in every field in general surgery that had been acquired over an educational period that had lasted from the time that I got out of the Navy, now for like 13 years, perpetual student syndrome, or a dilettante syndrome. Well, I like to think of myself as a gifted dilettante, but being a dilettante in and of itself is not a good idea.
I want to tell one brief vignette. So Joe and I were once flying from Dallas to San Francisco, something that we've done on many occasions, and we are on several boards together. And on this particular occasion, this was a number of years ago, Joe, we sat together. And about halfway through the flight, a gentleman was coming back, I guess, from the restroom, and he recognizes Joe. And he says, "Oh my goodness," he says, "you're Joe Goldstein, that famous doctor who won the Nobel Prize. I read about you in the paper all the time. I'm so excited about what you do." And on and on and on. Joe just wanted to go under the chair. Yeah, I mean, you just could see the discomfiture. But these guys are really celebrities. So I would sort of end on that note that although they wear this mantle with a great deal of grace, they still are recognized both amongst the scientific community and the lay community for everything they've done.
So since you told that story, some
Yeah.
people do, it's not as common as it used to be in Dallas. They would always see me or Mike or both of us and say, "Oh, you're the guy who won the Peace Prize." You explain, "No, we did this and another." Now we just say, "Yeah."
Right. Oh my
But I'll
goodness.
just end with one vignette about partnerships. Very frequently, people will call me Joe, and I, and I always say, and they're always embarrassed. And I say, don't be embarrassed. My wife makes the same mistake.
I love it.
I've seen many of your previous interviews that you've given or things that you've written about how being Jewish has influenced your view on the world, and particularly, can you believe in God and believe in Darwin at the same time?
No, you cannot. You cannot. And it's a very interesting issue because people are asking me, especially, I'm coming to talk to Jews, and Jews are somehow glued by religion. Some are not religious, some are atheists, some are conservative, some are reform, so there are grading in Judaism. For me, Judaism is a culture. I mean, it's a history of people, it's a language, it's music, it's history, it's the desire for a homeland, and it's morality, and with all the dents that have been poked into this issue and because of politics and recent politics, and so on and so forth. And but kids are asking me, do you believe in God or don't you? And it's tough. It's tough not because, for me it's tough. It's tough to tell them the right answer because they're kids. They don't know about mutations, randomness, survival of the fitting, Darwin, Wallace, not only Darwin. And they are growing up at homes. They are 10 years old, and they are growing to release to parents that. So you cannot tell them, you know, forget everything you have learned. Tell your parents they are fools or whatever. You have to really approach them that everybody has his own God, his own beliefs. You know, God is about morality, or God is about behavior. God is about peace. God is about human relationship. The prayers are, for me, poets. You know, I'm going to the synagogue just to read to be in the right atmosphere. This Saturday here in New York, I'm going to the service just to be embedded in the atmosphere. It has nothing to do with believing in God or not, but I think that God and Darwin are absolutely in non-talking terms, and I've sided with one.
You told me once a story about how you were so excited at the time about it that you didn't even let the PhD or the postdocs finish the experiments, but as your confirmatory experiments were unfolding, you went in and hybridized the blots yourself and developed things.
So it wasn't a matter of, I would have been perfectly happy for anybody else to do it, to do the experiments, but no one else was around, and I didn't really want to, I didn't feel like I was in a mental state to wait. What happened was, earlier in the relevant week, someone had found that one of the genes in the region of the OB gene was completely fat specific. Now, we had spent a lot of time imagining where the defective gene might be expressed. No one really knew. And one of my great concerns was that it might be expressed in a tiny cell type, such as islets in the pancreas, that would make it rather elusive if you were basing at least part of the gene identification strategy on where it was expressed. Nonetheless, when we saw a gene expressed exclusively in fat in the region, that captured our attention. And so the key question was, is the defective gene, is the gene defective in OB mice versus wild type? So I happen to know that one of the postdocs had labeled a probe that was used for the northern blot that showed expression in fat. Another had made blots anticipating this moment of RNAs from mutant and wild type animals. And so I went in that night after having called everyone, and I was unable to reach them. So I set up the blot myself and developed it late one night or early one morning on a Sunday.
What was that moment like of understanding that you had actually narrowed it down?
It was pretty frickin' awesome. And it was really one of the great moments of my life.
So later, the results from that trial showed a 5-month increase in survival, and the FDA in 2004 approved the use of Avastin for renal cell carcinoma and colorectal carcinoma. So what was your feeling on the day you got the news that it was approved?
It was really stunning. It was an incredible period because there was lots of negative feelings about the angiogenesis. Everybody would have bet that this colorectal trial would have failed. There was even publication from prominent group that actually predict that the drug that target VEGF is going to fail, just like another class of drugs called MMP inhibitor. Matrix and metalloproteinase inhibitor. So there was actually this sense of inevitable failure of this effort. So it was incredibly refreshing study, see that actually this data could defy these dire predictions and certainly validate a lot of work.
Did you have champagne? Was there a big party? Did you have a parade on the Genentech grounds?
I don't think so. I remember actually I learned the news from actually Art Levinson, our CEO. He was so kind, to call me. I was actually in Siena, doing like a week of lecture in this lovely city in Tuscany. I remember I drank a whole bottle of Chianti after I had this news.
Is it true that you were asked to be the director of NIH twice?
More than twice, yes.
And you turned them down both times.
I did. And the reason I did is that I felt strongly that I had reached the point where the balance between being close to the science, being able to continue to do clinical medicine, and yet still having a broad and significant impact on policy was where I am now as the director of NIAID. I remember very clearly that Secretary of HHS, Lou Sullivan, during the George H.W. Bush administration, couldn't believe that I didn't want to be NIH director. And he said, the Bush administration is saying, bring Tony in and we'll offer him the job. And I said, I don't want it. And Lou Sullivan said, well, you go tell the president. I'm not going to tell him. So I said, Lou, don't do it. Don't bring me to the White House because I'm going to have to say no to the president. And he said, oh, no, there's no way you're going to do that. We're bringing to the White House. He brought me to the White House, and John Sununu was the chief of staff at the time, and we were waiting outside the Oval Office, and George H.W. Bush was there, and Sununu said, you are going to accept it, aren't you? And I said, Governor, this is Governor Sununu, I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not. He says, no way you're going to say no to the president. So I walked in, I sat down, and George H.W. Bush, in his wonderful way, truly, forget about politics, is really one of the nicest human beings you'll ever want to meet. We chatted a bit, and then he said, I want you to be the NIH director. And I said, you know, Mr. President, with all due respect, I think I can serve you and the country better if I stay where I am, because we were right in the evolution of the AIDS pandemic. And I said, this is what I do and what I do really well, and this is really what you want me for. And we talked about it a bit, and then at the end of it, I thought he was going to really blow me off and be very, very gruff about it. And he said, you know, I respected you a lot before today, but now I really respect you. So go back and do your thing. And as I walked out the door, John Sununu grabbed me by the arm and he said, you son of a bitch. And we both of us started laughing. And then it actually strengthened my relationship with George H.W. Bush, because after that he continued to call upon me and ask my advice about things. So rather than being a negative, it turned out to be actually a positive.
Very impressive. These researchers represent the best of science, and as a result, were awarded Lasker Prizes. Let's hear them comment on how this recognition impacted them.
Probably the awards in society, including science, is useful as a motivational, aspirational tool. And I can tell you it is nice to know that you haven't wasted all your time doing research, and you can convince your parents, relatives, spouse that yes, you haven't been wasting all your time doing this work.
Well, I mean, look, the Lasker Award is an incredibly great honor, but I have to say that there was no professional moment I've ever had that matched actually that moment of developing the film and seeing the actual results. You know, other people have said it in their fields, and it was true in mine. I mean, you're looking at are blobs on a blot that are uninterpretable to most other people who are not used to looking at things in that way. But it revealed a really elegant and simple biological system configured by nature that to me is incredibly beautiful. And so it was a very important moment. And I sometimes think that recognition of the sort of the Lasker is in part really nice, because it reminds you of that moment. It keeps that moment alive, as does the research one continues to do.
Well, it's a very humbling experience, because I think it's been it's wonderful to be recognized, but at the same time, actually, I mean, reflecting the work of many people. I think there are lots of people that contribute to this work. Sometimes they don't appear in this big award. I always feel very, I mean, grateful, to the work done by my colleagues, my collaborators. To me, they were almost, family. People in my lab, contributed so much to this success, and I thank all of them, And also, all of this also validate, all of this research, I think, it's very important in science.
Thanks for joining Claire and I to watch these highlights. The full interviews are available on both the JCI and the Lasker websites.